The ring wasn't hers to wear. The name wasn't hers to carry. Even the house she walked through every morning belonged, in every way that mattered, to a man she had known for 11 days before she married him. Josephine Hartley had been given to Edmund Voss, the way you gave away a chair you no longer had room for, with a brief explanation and a hope that the new owner wouldn't look too closely at the legs. She had known this. She had walked into the church on a Tuesday in March, with her eyes open, and her hands folded, and her heart somewhere behind her sternum, making a sound like a door being closed in an empty house. Her father had stood beside her and looked at the floor. Her mother had cried, which everyone assumed was sentiment, and which Josephine knew was relief. The Hartley family had two problems. The first was money. The second was her brother Clifton. Both of these problems had a solution, and the solution was standing at the altar in a dark coat, watching her come toward him, with the particular patience of a man who had agreed to a transaction and intended to honor it. Edmund Voss was 34. He had a house in Western Virginia, 200 acres of good farmland, a reputation for fairness that people mentioned in the same breath as his name, and no particular need for a wife, except that his mother had died the previous winter, and left the household without someone who knew how it ran. He had not, as far as Josephine could tell, wanted her specifically. He had simply wanted the position filled, and her father had offered, and the numbers had worked, and here they both were. The numbers, that was the part that sat in Josephine's chest, like a splinter she couldn't quite locate. Her father's debts were not a secret, not really, not in a county where everyone's business eventually became everyone's business. But the extent of them had been. She had known they were behind. She had not known how far behind until the afternoon her mother came to her room and sat on the edge of the bed with the expression of a woman holding something very heavy and looking for somewhere to put it down. Edmund Voss had paid the debts. All of them, including the note her brother Clifton had signed, with a man in Charlottesville for reasons their father still couldn't quite bring himself to explain directly. Edmund had paid it without being asked for an explanation. He had received one anyway, eventually in pieces, over the course of a conversation that Josephine had not been present for, but had heard about secondhand, through the particular quality of silence that followed it in her mother's kitchen. He had married her 3 weeks later. The house was nothing like she'd expected. She'd expected cold, the practical coldness of a man who had made a business arrangement and intended to keep it businesslike. Instead, the house was simply quiet, not unfriendly, not warm, exactly, but not the thing she'd braced herself for either. Edmund moved through it with a kind of methodical calm, and the household staff treated her with the cautious courtesy of people who had not yet decided what she was, and were waiting for more information before forming an opinion. She couldn't blame them. She was waiting for the same information herself. The first month passed the way months passed when you were learning a new place. By the particular location of the creaky step. By the way the light came through the kitchen window at 7 in the morning. By learning which of the staff preferred to be thanked directly, and which found it embarrassing. Edmund was at the table most mornings. He worked from the house more than she'd expected. He asked her questions, not personal ones but practical ones. Whether she preferred the south garden kept or let go until spring, whether the household accounts had been explained to her adequately, whether she had everything she needed. She answered all of them. They were the kinds of questions she knew how to answer. What she did not know was what to do with the evenings. They ate dinner together, they talked, which was itself a surprise. Not the careful neutral talk she'd expected, but real talk, the kind that required opinions. Edmund had opinions about nearly everything. Not loudly. Not in the way that meant he needed to be agreed with, but in the way that meant he'd thought about things and reached conclusions, and was interested in whether other people had reached different ones. He asked her what she thought about a matter in the county. She told him. He didn't agree. He said so. She said so back. And then the strange thing happened. He was interested, not in changing her mind, not in explaining why he was right, but in the actual texture of disagreement, in what had led her there. Josephine went to bed that first night of real conversation and stared at the ceiling for an hour. She had not prepared herself for a man who was interesting. The second month, her brother Clifton came to visit. Clifton Hartley was 26, and had their father's particular combination of charm and poor judgment, that worked extremely well in drawing rooms, and extremely badly everywhere else. He had their mother's eyes and a smile that people trusted immediately without quite knowing why. And he had been running through goodwill in this county for 3 years the way a man runs through money when he doesn't believe it will ever run out. He arrived on a Thursday without warning, which was itself a signal. Clifton never arrived without warning, unless he needed something he didn't want to ask for in a letter, where it could be read twice and answered carefully. Josephine met him in the front hall. He embraced her and said she looked wonderful, and that marriage clearly agreed with her, which told her immediately that he wanted something significant because Clifton only complimented people when he was about to ask them for something. She gave him the guest room, told Mrs. Brennan to set another place at dinner, and waited. He lasted 4 hours before he told her. There was another debt. Not the Charlottesville one. That one was paid, settled, done. This was a newer one, or rather an older one that had resurfaced, a note that a man named Beaumont held, which Clifton had signed 18 months ago and had apparently believed wouldn't come due, and had apparently been wrong about. The number was not small. Josephine sat across from her brother in the small parlor while the evening settled around them, and felt the specific feeling of being handed a problem that was not hers. It had a weight she recognized. She'd been carrying versions of it for 4 years. "I cannot ask Edmund," she said. "I'm not asking you to ask him directly," Clifton said. "I'm only telling you the situation. You are telling me the situation because you want me to ask him." Clifton had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "Only slightly. You have his ear. I have been married to him for 2 months, Clifton. I have his breakfast table. That's more than the rest of us have." He leaned forward. "Joe, Beaumont is not a patient man. If this isn't settled by the end of the season, then you should have thought of that 18 months ago." The words came out flat and quiet, without the heat she would have expected from herself. Clifton blinked. He was not accustomed to flat and quiet from her. She had spent most of her life being the one who softened things. "I will think about it," she said. "That is all I'm promising." He left the next morning. He'd wanted to stay through the weekend, and she had not told him he couldn't, but he'd read something in her face at breakfast, and decided to go, which was possibly the most perceptive thing Clifton had ever done, and it made her sad that it had taken this particular morning to surface it. She thought about it for 3 days. She went through the household accounts, the real ones, the full picture, because Edmund had given her access to everything the week after they married, quietly and without ceremony, as if it were simply the obvious thing to do. She sat at the small writing desk in the parlor and looked at the numbers and worked out what the margin was and what it wasn't. On the 4th morning, she came to breakfast and waited until Edmund had his coffee and his paper, and then she said, "I need to tell you something that I am not going to ask you to fix." He set down the paper. He gave her his full attention, which was one of the things she'd noticed about him. When he listened entirely. No part of him was somewhere else. "My brother came last week," she said. "He has another debt. A different one from the one that was settled before the marriage. He came here because he thought I might ask you to cover it." Edmund was quiet. "I am not asking you to cover it," Josephine said. "I am telling you about it because it exists, because you have a right to know what is circling around the edges of your household, and because I will not have you hear about it later from someone else, and wonder why I didn't say so." Edmund looked at her steadily. "How much?" She told him the number. He didn't flinch, which she'd expected. He didn't immediately offer to pay it, which she hadn't expected, but probably should have been prepared for, because Edmund was not a man who moved fast in any direction. He sat with the information for a moment the way he sat with most things, long enough to actually see it. "What does your brother intend to do?" he asked. "I don't know. I told him I would think about it. I've thought about it. My conclusion is that I cannot go on covering for Clifton's decisions, that doing so has never once led to Clifton making a different decision, and that the person who is least equipped to save him from himself is me." Another pause, longer this time. "That must have been a difficult conclusion to reach," Edmund said. "I've been reaching it for 4 years, she said. "I've just been refusing to finish the sentence." Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically. Edmund did nothing dramatically, but it shifted. "I'm not going to pay it," he said. "Not because I couldn't, because I think you're right that it wouldn't help him." Josephine exhaled once, slowly. "I'll write to Beaumont myself," Edmund said. "I'll make arrangements to extend the note and tell him it's on good faith for 6 months. That gives Clifton time to manage it without being managed. Whether he uses the time is his affair." She looked at him across the breakfast table. "You don't have to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it's the right amount of help. Not too much." He picked up his coffee. "You know what too much looks like. That's why you came to tell me." Josephine went to the small parlor after breakfast and stood at the window and felt the strange, particular feeling of being seen clearly by a person she had not expected to see her at all. She stayed at the window for a long time. The trouble started in April. It started, as trouble often did in this county, at a social occasion where too many people had been in a room too long, and the conversation had run out of innocuous things to say. There was a dinner at the Fenwick house. The Fenwicks were socially central, in a way that meant their dinners were both unavoidable and slightly exhausting, and Josephine had attended with Edmund, and spent the first hour navigating the specific kind of attention that attached itself to a new wife in a small county. Polite interest from the women, assessment from the older ones, from certain younger ones, something harder to name. The younger one in question was a Miss Dorinda Alcott. She was 23, pretty in an uncomplicated way, and had, Josephine learned within the first 20 minutes, been expected by a portion of the county to become Mrs. Edmund Voss. Not because there had been any formal understanding between them. There hadn't. But because she had been at the right socialettes for 2 years, and Edmund had spoken with her at several of them, and someone had decided this was significant. Josephine did not learn this from anyone who told her directly. She learned it the way she had always learned difficult things in this family. By being in the right place, when 2 other people forgot she was there. She had stepped out of the main room toward the end of the evening to find a quieter moment. And she heard 2 women talking near the library door. And she heard her husband's name, and she did not move away. He was very attentive to Dorinda last spring, the first voice said. Attentive isn't a promise, the second voice answered. No, but then he married that Hartley girl 3 weeks after her father asked him. 3 weeks, and you know what her brother did. A pause. I'm not saying she's not perfectly adequate. I'm saying she was convenient. Josephine stood in the hallway and let the words go through her, the way cold water went through you. Not painfully, not angrily, just completely. Convenient, yes, that was the accurate word. She had known it was the accurate word since the Tuesday in March. The fact that it was being said in a hallway at the Fenwick house didn't change that it was true. What it changed was something else. Something she hadn't quite examined yet. She went back into the main room. She found Edmund talking with 2 other men and stood at his elbow and said nothing about what she'd heard, and smiled at the correct moments and said the correct things and went home in the carriage beside him and looked out the window at the April dark and kept her face entirely still. You're quiet, Edmund said halfway home. I'm thinking, she said, about the Fenwick dinner, about something I heard at it. He looked at her. She could feel it without turning. Are you going to tell me? She was quiet for a moment. I heard 2 women discussing the fact that Dorinda Alcott had expected to be in my position, and that my arrival was considered by some people to be an act of convenience rather than choice. The carriage moved through the dark. Edmund said nothing immediately, which meant he was thinking, which she'd learned to wait for. Is that a surprise to you? He said finally. She turned to look at him. Which part? Any of it? No, she said. I've known since March that I was convenient. The question I've been sitting with since tonight is whether convenient is all I am. Silence. Longer this time. What made tonight different from March? He asked. She turned back to the window. Hearing someone else say it made me realize I hadn't actually asked. Another silence. And then quietly, you could ask now. Josephine looked at her hands in the dark. Am I here because I was what was available? She said. Or am I here because you chose this? Those aren't mutually exclusive, Edmund said. I know. I'm asking which one is more true. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. And then he said, carefully, in the voice he used when he was being as precise as he could manage. Your father approached me. That's true. The timing was convenient. That's also true. What is equally true is that I had met you twice before, and I had a clear enough impression to believe that the arrangement could become something real, and I agreed to it partly because of the circumstances, and partly because I thought it was worth trying. A pause. That is an honest answer. It is not a romantic one. Josephine considered this. I prefer honest answers, she said. I know, he said. That's part of what made me think it was worth trying. She went to bed that night and lay in the dark and felt something settle in her chest that had been floating loose since March. The social matter of Dorinda Alcott did not resolve quietly. It arrived properly, as these things did, through a series of small incidents that each seemed manageable on their own, and which were collectively something else. A look at church that lasted a beat too long. A comment at a neighbor's tea that Josephine caught the edge of but not the center. A visit from Dorinda's mother, Mrs. Lucinda Alcott, a woman of enormous social confidence and the particular social gift of saying cutting things in language that required effort to identify as cutting, which lasted 40 minutes and was framed as a friendly call, and which Josephine with the distinct impression that she had been assessed and found wanting in some way that Mrs. Alcott intended to act on. She said nothing to Edmund. She thought about the carriage conversation. She thought about what he'd said. Honest answer, not a romantic one. And she thought about what he hadn't said and what she was still working out how to ask. The thing she was still working out how to ask was this. Did he want the marriage to be real? Not the arrangement. The arrangement was real. But the thing underneath the arrangement, the actual daily life of two people living in the same house, having breakfast at the same table, talking in the evenings about things that required genuine thought. Did he want that, or was he tolerating it? She wasn't sure she could ask that directly. She wasn't sure she was ready to hear the honest answer. What she was ready for was the next thing Mrs. Alcott did, which arrived without warning on a Wednesday morning in the form of a story. She heard it from their neighbor, Mrs. Pembroke, who arrived at 10 o'clock with the expression of a woman delivering information she was both reluctant and eager to share. Josephine gave her tea and waited. The story was this. Dorinda Alcott had begun telling people, quietly but not quietly enough, that Edmund's marriage to Josephine had been arranged under circumstances that weren't entirely above reproach. That Josephine's father had pressed the arrangement at a moment when Edmund was grieving his mother. That Edmund had agreed in a state of, Mrs. Pembroke's voice dropped here, diminished judgment. That the Hartley family's finances, and specifically Clifton's situation, had been used as a kind of leverage that no gentleman should have been subjected to. Josephine sat across from Mrs. Pembroke and listened to all of it without changing her expression. I thought you should know, Mrs. Pembroke said. Yes, Josephine said. Thank you for telling me. Mrs. Pembroke left. Josephine sat in the parlor for a long time after, looking at the window, letting the story settle into its actual shape. Not the emotional shape. She wasn't, she noticed, particularly angry. What she was clear. The story wasn't entirely false, which was what made it effective. Her father had pressed the arrangement. The Hartley finances had been part of the conversation. These were real things. What the story did was take those real things and add a layer, diminished judgment, leverage, something arranged wrongly. And that layer was not real. And it was designed to make Edmund look like a man who had been managed. And it was designed to make Josephine look like the instrument of that managing. And the particular piece of it that made her stand up and walk out of the parlor was this. It made Edmund look foolish. And Edmund was not a foolish man. He was the opposite of a foolish man. And whoever had thought this story up either didn't know him or was betting that enough people didn't know him well enough to say so. She found Edmund in the study. I need to tell you something, she said. He turned from the desk. She told him. All of it, exactly as Mrs. Pembroke had delivered it, without softening the edges or shaping it toward a particular conclusion. When she finished, she waited. Edmund sat with it. He always sat with things. She had learned to wait. How long has this been circulating, he said. I don't know. Mrs. Pembroke heard it within the last day or two. And you're telling me now. I'm telling you within 20 minutes of hearing it myself, she said. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. Why? She looked back at him steadily. Because it's about you. Because you have the right to know what is being said about your judgment. And because, she stopped, started again. Because I am not going to be a woman who hears her husband being called a fool and says nothing about it. He was quiet. Whatever was happening in his face was something she couldn't quite read yet, because she hadn't known him long enough to have all the keys to it. But it was not what she'd expected. It wasn't anger. It wasn't the composed practicality she's usually got. It was something more immediate than that. What do you want to do about it, he said. I don't know yet. I have some thoughts. I wanted to know if you had any first. My first thought, Edmund said, is that this is going to be easier to address if we address it together. She looked at him. My second thought, he said, is that I would like to know what your thoughts are. She sat down across from the desk. They talked for an hour. The kind of talking she had not done in this marriage yet. Not careful, not measured, but the real kind where the words had edges. She said some things she hadn't planned to say. He said some things that surprised her. By the time they finished, she had a plan, and it wasn't hers alone. The first step was Edmund, not Josephine. He made calls himself, quietly, to 3 men whose opinions carried weight in the county. He did not ask them for help. He gave them the factual account, his own account, clearly stated, of how the marriage had come about, that he had been approached, that he had considered the arrangement with full faculties, that he had agreed because he had found the prospect sound, and had chosen to enter it. He said this plainly, the way he said most things, and the plainness was its own argument because Edmund Voss was not a man who was known to hedge, and so when he stated something directly it tended to be believed. The second step was Josephine. She paid a call on Mrs. Alcott. She had not announced it in advance. That was deliberate. She arrived at 11 on a Thursday and asked to be received and was, because Mrs. Alcott was too social to close a door to anyone without a specific reason, and she had not yet been given a specific reason, because Josephine had not yet done anything. They sat in the Alcott's front parlor with tea between them, and the particular charged courtesy of two women who were both aware of exactly what the situation was, and neither of whom was going to say so directly first. Josephine said it directly first. "I've come because I understand that a version of my marriage is being described in this county that is different from the actual marriage," she said. "I thought it made more sense to come directly to the person I believe started it than to spend the next several months watching it travel." Mrs. Alcott's expression went through three things quickly: surprise, irritation, and then the smooth surface of a woman reassembling herself. "I don't know what you've heard," Mrs. Alcott said. "I've heard the same thing you've heard," Josephine said. "You and I both know where it started." A long pause. "My daughter," Mrs. Alcott said, "was treated unfairly. Your daughter," Josephine said evenly, "was not in any formal understanding with my husband. I have verified this. Edmund has confirmed this. The expectation that existed was one your family created and maintained without his knowledge or participation. That is not treatment. That is a misunderstanding you have been unwilling to revise." Mrs. Alcott set down her teacup. "I am not going to apologize for Dorinda's expectations," she said. "I'm not asking you to," Josephine said. "I'm asking you to stop asking others to pay for them. Specifically, I'm asking you to stop describing my husband as a man who entered a marriage under compromised judgment. He is not that man. Everyone who knows him knows he is not that man, and I will spend as much time as necessary making sure everyone who might have believed otherwise has heard differently." Mrs. Alcott was quiet. The kind of quiet that came from a woman calculating. "You're very direct," she said finally. "My husband is a direct man," Josephine said. "I've found it's efficient." She left 30 minutes later. Her hands were steady. She had expected them to shake and they didn't, which told her something about herself that she filed away to examine later. The story changed. Not all at once. These things didn't change all at once, and Josephine didn't expect them to, but the version that Mrs. Alcott had been circulating lost its momentum over the course of 2 weeks. The way a rumor lost momentum when enough people who knew better said so with enough calm conviction. Edmund noticed. He didn't say anything about it directly for several days, which was also him. He processed things at his own pace and let her do the same. Then one evening after dinner, while they were in the sitting room with the April dark outside the windows, he said, "You went to see Lucinda Alcott. 3 people told you," Josephine guessed. 4, he said. "Within a week. Did they tell you what I said?" "Most of it." She looked at him. "And," he looked back at her, "I want to know why you didn't tell me first." She'd been expecting this. She had her answers ready. "Because I knew what you would say," she told him. "You would say we should address it together. And you'd have been right, and we would have talked it through, and the plan would have been careful, and measured, and correct. And all of that would have taken 2 days, and in 2 days the story would have traveled further. I went because it was faster to go myself." She paused. "Also because it made me angry. And anger makes me fast." He looked at her for a long moment. "Were you angry for yourself?" he said. "Or for me?" She considered this honestly. "Both," she said, "but more for you." He was quiet for a moment. "That is," he said carefully, "the first time anyone has gone somewhere on my behalf without asking if I minded. I should have asked." "No," he suggested. "I'm saying it's new. I'm not saying it's wrong." He paused. "I'm trying to tell you that I noticed." She looked at him across the sitting room. At this man she had known for 4 months, whom she had expected to be an arrangement, and who was turning out to be something she didn't have a previous word for. Who sat with things before speaking. Who gave her the real account books without ceremony. Who had paid a debt he didn't owe and not used it to make her feel the debt. Who had said, in a carriage in the April dark, "I thought it was worth trying." "Edmund," she said, "are you telling me that you are glad I went?" He looked at her with an expression she had never quite seen from him before. Not the practical steadiness. Not the consideration. Something more immediate. "I am telling you," he said slowly, "that I have been wondering for 4 months whether this was going to become a real marriage. And what I've been watching is you deciding, in your own way and at your own pace, that you are going to treat it as real, regardless of whether it deserves to be. And I find that I have been." He stopped. "Tried again. I have been paying very close attention." Josephine looked at her hands in her lap. Then back up. "Have you reached a conclusion?" she said. "Several," he said. "The most important one is that I would like very much for this to be a real marriage." She was quiet for a long moment. The April night pressed against the windows. From somewhere in the house a door closed softly. "Then we should probably stop being quite so polite to each other," she said. He almost smiled. It was the closest he had come to it in her presence, and it changed his face entirely. And she decided immediately that she intended to see it again. "I'm generally considered very polite," he said. "I've noticed," she said. "I think politeness has been your way of leaving room for me to decide. I appreciate it. I've decided." He set down his coffee and looked at her directly. "What have you decided?" She looked back at him. At this man she had been handed, and who had not felt like an arrangement for at least 6 weeks, and who had not once tried to manage her, or soften her edges, or ask her to be something different from what she was. Who had given her the real books. Who had said, the right amount of help, not too much. "I've decided," she said, "that I would like to know who you are in 10 years. Something moved through his face then that she had not seen from him before, and suspected few people had. Something that was not managed, not composed, not the result of sitting with a thing long enough to know how to present it. Just a man, startled into honesty by someone who had come directly at him. "That," he said quietly, "is the first thing you have said that I didn't see coming." "Good," she said. "I intend for that to be a pattern." They did not resolve everything that night. There was still Clifton, who would make a choice about Beaumont's note that Josephine could not control and had decided to stop trying to. There was still her mother, who wrote letters full of hope and subtext that Josephine answered carefully and honestly and without giving more than was asked for. There was still the county and its opinions, which shifted and resettled like water, and would continue to do so, regardless of what either of them did. But there was also this, the sitting room, and the April night, and the particular change in the quality of air between two people who have simultaneously stopped, pretending something isn't happening. She wrote to Clifton the following week, a real letter, not a managed one. She told him that Edmund had extended the time on Beaumont's note and that the 6 months existed not as a rescue but as a window, and that what he did with the window was entirely up to him. She told him she loved him and that loving him had never required believing that covering his mistakes was the same as helping him. She told him that she was not going to be the person who softened every landing, and that she expected in return that he would stop looking for the person who would. It was the hardest letter she had ever written, and also the most precise one. She did not know if he would read it and understand, or if he would read it and feel abandoned. That was his to work out. She had put the truth in the letter and sealed it before she could revise it into something kinder and less useful. Edmund came to find her in the parlor that afternoon. He looked at the sealed letter on the desk without asking what it was. Then he looked at her. "How are you?" he asked. It was such a simple question. She had been asked it dozens of times since March, and had given the same dozen variations of fine, and thank you, and managing well. This time she sat with it for a moment and gave it a real answer. "I'm better than I expected to be," she said, "which is different from fine." He nodded once. The nod of a man who understood that distinction. "Are you busy?" he said. "I was just finishing." "Then come see the North Field," he said. "The winter wheat is up. I'd like your opinion on whether we're managing the drainage correctly." She looked at him. "You'd like my opinion on drainage? You looked at the accounts for the whole property," he said. "I assumed you formed opinions." She had in fact formed opinions, 3 of them, all specific. She stood and picked up the sealed letter to give to the post boy, and walked with him out through the kitchen and into the May morning, which was warm and green and full of the particular sound of land that was being worked and cared for and taken seriously. He walked beside her. She told him what she'd noticed about the drainage numbers. He listened, the way he listened to everything, entirely, without saving part of himself for somewhere else. And then he told her what he'd been thinking about the North Field for the last 3 years, and why he hadn't changed it yet, and what he thought might need to happen in the fall. It was not a romantic conversation. It was something better. When she looked back on this marriage, years later, she would not remember it as beginning on a Tuesday in March in a church. She would remember it as beginning on a May morning in a field she was learning to know, walking beside a man she was also learning to know. Talking about drainage and wheat and the specific mathematics of a piece of land that was hers now, actually hers, not borrowed, not held temporarily, not arranged. Edmund said something about the east fence, and she answered, and they walked further into the field, and the morning continued around them, warm and patient and entirely real. She had not expected to be here. She had not expected any of it. Not the real account books, not the carriage conversation, not the sitting room and the April night, and the thing she had seen in his face, when she said she wanted to know him in 10 years. She had married a man she didn't know and had decided somewhere along the way. In kitchens at odd hours, in parlors where she'd said difficult, true things, in a sitting room where she'd stopped pretending nothing was happening, to treat the marriage as real regardless. The real version had turned out to be better than the managed one. That was the whole of it. That was enough. That would keep being enough, she suspected, for a very long time.